a stooge or some sort of his own persons or politicians loyal to him, then we could call it a credible process, and we could say he did his own best as a military leader to restore democracy to his country. The extent to which the military leader can be trusted depends largely on the outcome of his actions rather than promises that he's able to make when he is still in power. Remember that we are talking about people ruling with the gun. There is always less argument with the gun, less dialogue with the gun than it can be with those who come to sit on the dialogue table with pens and then with the mind and with ideas and with visions and concepts and theories of how to shape the country. So this is a historic moment for the country. This is a moment that we are hoping that this African country that have known a lot of military leaders and its democracy have been intercepted and interrupted over time would find again once more in the life of its country a moment of constitutionality, a moment of limit to presidential term office and respect of such limit, to the extent that no president will have the power, the will, the ability to modify clandestinely these articles of the Constitution that will permit him to break the limits, just like the case in other African countries, Mali, Turbulent, Burkina Faso, Niger, even Cameroon, you know. Even without the military rule in Cameroon, it has been the case of modification of constitution with intentions of hanging on to power. These are issues still plaguing a lot of African countries. So we applaud when we see a leader, be it in a military attire or in the civilian attire, that wants to make necessary reforms to put the country in the right track of political stability in order to foster economic progress and development.
Mr. Fabrice LENA, political figure, thank you so much for that input. Now on to you, Dr. FONGOD. Have a listen to your co-panelists. He started well in his response that they do exist, you know, different military regimes across the West African sub-region, why not other parts of the African continent, but it would take time to tell if, you know, if no military personnel is going to actually not participate in the upcoming elections in Guinea. With that said, how has military leadership across the African continent go a long way in reshaping governance?
Well, look, it's quite a conflicting thing, and the reason for that is because at some point, I lean towards military rule, especially when it has to be about hostile takeover of regimes that have refused to bow to common sense, and when the people are left to go through intense pain and chaos. And there's a lot to be said, especially if you have to look at countries to which it is that it's been 6, 7 decades, all right, or 5 decades, 4 decades of the same regime. You have to start asking yourself, for how long can we be able to tolerate such? And for how long are we going to sit on the sidelines and allow history, all right, to just unfold in such vicious and hateful vitriol for the people? And one of the things that I find quite interesting is that to those who basically look at governance and look at the idea of holding onto power are people who do not fully understand what it means to live. Because for you to understand what it means to live, you must understand what it means to die. What that means is each and every one of us, we are passing. I don't think that there's anyone who is holding on to anything, forever. You cannot hold to anything on anything anything forever. Whether you like it or not, the clothes you wear today, someone will have to make decisions on those clothes tomorrow. The houses you build, the cars you have, somebody will have to make decisions on those things tomorrow. I think that we all live because other people are. You cannot lead guinea pigs. You are not leading a country of chicken. You are not leading a country of pigs. You are living countries of human. You are not in office because those who surround you have no true functioning brain cells or have no emotions. So you are leading people. And there has to be that consciousness when it comes to leadership across the continent of Africa, where we fully understand that our loyalty is not to self. Our loyalty has to be to the people. Our loyalty is not to political parties. Our loyalty is to the people. It has nothing to do, with some political party or yourself. You have to be loyal to the country. You have to express certain levels of loyalty to country. If you're not doing that, then there's no reason for you absolutely being in leadership. So when that becomes the norm, when that becomes the tenant to which it is that most countries do run on, and then when somebody shows up and basically calls for a coup and is successful, we sit on the sidelines and then we applaud, but then we are always also very conscious that whatever we are applauding cannot be long-lived. We cannot close our eyes in our applaud. It's like you're praying. You can't close your eyes in this prayer. Your eyes needs to be open. And the reason for that is because you understand that in military rule, the notion, just like, my brother Fabrice was talking about, it is extremely quite difficult to have any form of dialogue. And the reason is because you can negotiate freely and fairly with somebody who is holding an AK-47. You need to be able to talk into someone who basically comes to the same table with ideas, all right? Not just showing up on the same, not just showing up, with a gun. And then in most cases, whatever the person says goes. And obviously you will not want to get into any kind of confrontation with the person who holds the barrel of the gun. The military is supposed to be some kind of an arbiter, some kind of a referee. The military is supposed to be someone who basically protects the nation from outside and also maintain some kind of a stability from within. That means that the military is not really supposed to basically, lean left or lean right, lean to one political party or the other. It has to be able to maintain some level of balance within the country. That's what the military is. The military is sacred. All right, the military actually is godlike in nature. When you look at any country, we have to be able to find ways in which we understand that on the continent so that we can be able to push the democratic agenda, the democratic mindset, allow people to get into the public discourse, have debate about where the country is going, have debate as to where resources are and what resources needs to be taken out of the countries, have debates as to where development needs to go, infrastructural development, what we need to do, what roads needs to be built first, and why. We need to be able to have those debates, where we are borrowing money, how much we are borrowing, what the interest rates are. Those things need to be handled in Parliament. It needs to be handled in the House of Assembly, whatever country you belong to and whatever bodies are in place. We need to be able to have those discussions. This is the tyrannical way in which we have things on the African continent. It's become bizarre. Look, if you're not careful, you will be 60, 70 years old, okay, haven't lived under the same regime. Nothing has changed. A few people within the political elite has basically made good and well for themselves, and the rest of the country has basically been in abject poverty. I don't think I want to have such on my own conscience. So in case when we do talk about, military takeover on the continent of Africa, I applaud. And I applaud, hoping that, somewhat they will do well and they will be able to bring about the necessary change that we need. And the change that is needed whenever there's a military takeover is not to build a robust economy. They do not have the capacity to do that. What they need to be able to do is to be able to give to us as the country, back our democracy, is able to hand to us the capacity to vote, the capacity to have public discourse, the capacity to get out into the public arena and have conversations with people without fear, of being persecuted because of our ideas. There are many people in prison today who are in prison not because they carried a gun. There are many people in prison today because they dare to think. And the truth of the matter is, if you can think, you will be at the risk, absolutely, of basically making somebody upset. And that's what you're supposed to do. Think and allow somebody to get upset, but let the person understand why you're thinking. Because if you can think, you will be at the risk of basically offending somebody. But I can't stop you from thinking. I think that is the freedom of expression. That's the freedom of speech. I have the right to say whatever I want to say. My brother is here. We have the right for disagreements. We have the right to agree and the right not to agree. But the only thing we cannot do is to pick up a gun and basically go at it because we do not agree, or I cannot be persecuted because of my ideas and my thoughts. We need to be able to have that level of freedom, and that freedom only comes in the democracy. It is not possible to have that when somebody is holding the gun, looking at you and asking you, what are you saying? Believe me, you would change your tune if that was the case.
Indeed, but hopefully we're looking at ways through which, they can work side by side. We remember citing an example like Ghana when in the terms of J.J. Rawlings, but now the country, West African country, stands as one of the icons, or a beacon of hope for democracy, not just in the West African sub-region, but for the African continent. Now over to you, Fabrice, LENA, you have listened to your co-panelists. I remember earlier on you stated that there is need to observe to see if, this promise made by the military leader of Guinea, Conakry, is actually going to come to pass. I would like to capitalize on that. Now, do you believe that any legal or constitutional measures so far have been put in place to ensure that no military, not just the military leader, but any member of the transitional government in the West African country doesn't run for election in 2025?
I think the announcement of the president is a simple presidential statement, which is in the form of an ordinance, or what they call in the French system an arrêté. It is not constitutionalized, because constitutionalizing such will mean that it is a bill sent to the parliament and then, of course, validated by majority of those who vote this. So it's not a law, but it is governance by simple presidential statement. Of course, it's a country in the process of transition, so this is very common. In transitional processes, president can take decisions based on the situation at hand. So there is no such thing as a legal backup or legal sanction in case this promise is not respected. That is often the nuance and difficulty with political promises, and the difficulty too with decisions taken by head of states in times of political instability. However, I think that most of the time, such decisions depend on what we call the political will of the leader. So if the leader have the political will to put the country on the right track, there is no need for anyone to doubt his statement or doubt what he intends to put in place. But at the same time, if he doesn't have the political will, he might just be saying this, to meet up to the aspirations of the people by pressure that the people are mounting, that the country needs to go back to democratic rule and so on and so forth. But there's also doubt as to the source of the power of the president. There are a lot of theories as to whether he's been put there by neo-colonialists, and there is also a lot of theories as to whether he is really a legitimate military ruler. We've seen the case of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger forming an alliance to counter the actions of neo-colonialists and powers that they deem are coming to exploit them and continue the agenda of neo-colonialism. However, there are also those who think that, well, he wants to manage his country in a unique way and may not want to go in the perspective of the other military leaders. But looking at the general notion of the rising populism of these young generational military leaders who give speeches of restoring the dignity of the African people, having the sovereignty of management of resources of the African people, complete control of their country, and managing their own military independently, we will ask ourselves, if the plans of moving to a civilian rule is in the continuation of those colonial arrangements that are still remaining remnants of the colonial arrangements, or in a new deal of the Africa we want, the Africa agenda of the Africa we want by the young and new generation Africa. These are the questions, and these are the things that need to be detailed, looked upon by Guineans themselves as people of this sovereign state, and also by concerned African like us, who is concerned about this East African country and its stability in the future. Sometimes the fluctuation between civilian and military role in countries is also because at the time when, or the moment where we see a glimpse of hope as to stability, we come to understand that there is a lot of background negotiations and actions that it's not being explained to the public. And it comes to backfire in the long run after taking the country hostage for a long time. So this kind of arrangement sometimes is not known by the local man. The local man sees the immediate, listens to the words of the president, trusts the process, but gets disappointed. But one of the funny things is, just like my brother said, we have few decades to live on Earth. So when you waste 7 to 10 years of someone's life, you can imagine the impact that it will have on such a person's life. And this is why most often we call on political leaders to, of course, seek their consciences, to be clear with the people, and to live and govern for the sake of the people. Because if not for the people, then there is no need for a social contract to be established between you who is in power and those you're governing. So it's important that the leader of Guinea should consider his people, should consider the sovereignty of his people, consider the fight of the founding father of Guinea, Ahmed Sékou Touré, who defied the French people, did everything possible to make his country an upright country by standing tall to all the challenges. And even when the concept of France-Afrique was born by Jacques Foccart and perpetrated by F and the other French agencies in Africa, he stood his ground that this will not, Guinea-Conakry will not be part of this kind of arrangement. And even with the franc CFA, he said Guinea will make his own francs with the image of African heroes like Patrice Lumumba on it, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the things that should recall or come to the mind of Guineans and the president of this country to say, hey, we've had great hero in this country, someone that had captured the attention of the continent, and we need to restore the dignity, the thoughts, the historical glory of this country to this present moment, not taking the country back again to those who wanted the country to be destroyed or to be under hostage by some sort of international conspiracy from the moment of the independence. So, in a nutshell, I would say that Guinea is at the crossroads, and it's a critical moment for all analysts, international stakeholders to be keen on this country, each person playing his role earnestly. Then I'm sure that Guinea is set to the path of political stability if the necessary pressure, internal and external, is meted on the junta leaders, and of course, the people rise up to their responsibility. Because most often, the decisions that political leaders take depend on the amount of pressure that the people can put, and also international stakeholders come when they see that the people are conscious enough and know exactly what they want and where they are going to. So with internal and external pressure, I think the leaders will do what is necessary.
But I'd like to stay with you, pinpointing from some of the points which you've cited so far. with all this said, do you believe that some of these disparities are one of the reasons why the leader of the West African country went ahead to state that no military leader will participate in the upcoming elections?
Inspired by a couple of factors, seeing what is happening in the neighboring countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. He's not an island, he's moved. Also seeing the recent development in Senegal with a young civilian leader that has become the model of youth leadership in Africa and the world at large. It's also a call for concern. And given the fact that the perception of the military has always been with skepticism, and of course we know that people obey military regimes by grudging compliance, most often not necessarily because they are the best, but of course the people do not have the choice to do so. So a multitude of factors push him to say, hey, but okay, if I have to do this, then I need to recall also historical past of the country, you know, the leadership of the independence movement fighter, the founding father of Guinea, you know, contemporary realities of the continent, and also maybe he wants to leave the country as a hero, as one of those who put the country on the right track, like what Rawlings did for Ghana, or what Obasanjo did for Nigeria, and a couple of others, Samora Machel, you know, for Mozambique. So a couple of others in the continent did the right thing for their country before leaving. They set the pace. So sometimes leaders are also inspired by the events they see around them, by what they know of the history, and of course they don't want to belong to the class of those who will be classified as the traitors of the continent. So I hope he will really want to write his name in the books of the heroes of the continent and not the traitors of the continent. And I think this is where he wants to go. Unless, as I said earlier, we have to evaluate him after the elections.
Thank you immensely. Now, moving forward with you, Dr. FONGOD, I'll be picking up from where your co-panelist stopped, and he mentioned, you know, key points that reverberate with what's happening across the West African sub-region. Now, how would this recent decision by the leader of the transitional government in Guinea go along with affecting the country's, you know, democratic transitional process and the timeline which the country has to return back to civilian rule, stating, because the leader during his end of New Year address highlighted that the three processes, which I would like to, you know, pinpoint the one for the constitutional change and as well the 2025 election to hold in the country, which he termed a crucial electoral process. So how is this going to go along with affecting the country's democratic transition?
Well, I think that, you know, we have to be able to look a little bit deeper into some of the things. There were benchmarks that were given by him. Unfortunately, some of those benchmarks never came to pass. So we were given a particular timeline. I think it was about 36 months. The whole thing got pushed to about 24. We have to be able to make sure that, you know, we don't keep pushing the goalposts so far as transition is concerned. And it's going to be good if we can just be able to go past, you know, the whole entire election process and just basically get people into office that needs to be there. Secondly, I am also skeptical with the issues of being able to stifle so far as making sure that certain political parties basically disappear has been the case, and accepting other political parties to be in place. There has to be some serious conversations, you know, in regard to that, because the whole entire idea of having free and fair elections is that there's equal representation across the board. So if you are going to be able to decide exactly who participate in the elections, then that is nothing else but meddling in the entire process, and the integrity of the process therefore is being called to question. We have to be able to find ways in which you actually allow everyone who has any kind of an ambition, as long as it's legitimate, to be able, and how to even define or assess legitimacy. We need to be able to know that as well. We need to be able to fully understand everything. What's your yardstick? what are you measuring this entire thing by? Why are you basically saying other political parties, cannot participate in the elections? Why are you basically, asking some political parties to dissolve? That in itself is quite problematic. We have to be able to make sure that anyone that wants to run can run. All right, and that is legitimate as long as you're not some kind of a ploy, as long as you're not, a single. And often at times it's always, the political party in power that goes out and create these phantom political parties just so that they can be able to create enough confusion and then create enough chaos to rig elections. But when you have a situation like what we have, well, it's military rule. Everybody else is an incumbent. So you have to be able to find ways in which you basically allow for free and fair elections, allow people to be able to get to the ballot box, number one, but allow those who want to be represented and allow those who want to basically, come into power and vie for political office to do so. I think that that's the first thing that I would like to see. For sure, there's going to be tremendous good being done to the nation. And I think that if you're going to understand the tenacity and the fortitude of the Guinea-Conakry's history, they were the very first country that stood up to France on the continent of Africa, and France literally sabotaged everything in that country. It was so bad that pipelines, all right, were filled with cement. Cars were basically made inoperable. France did it worst in Guinea. And that was to send a message to Francophone countries that if you're going to try this madness, this is what we're going to do to you. I wish that every French African country back then had followed the mandate and the ideas that Guinea-Conakry put in place, and how they basically said we're not going to basically have this conditional surrender in terms of democracy and in terms of the colonial era. We're going to basically be independent and free no matter what. Had it been that French African countries followed suit and followed that same pattern, Africa's story and Africa's history would have been different. Africa's history would have been different, and for sure the history of France in Europe too would have been different. Unfortunately, we had a whole lot more cowards in many African countries than there were in Guinea-Conakry. So I think that we really have to be able to find ways in which we can be able to remind those folks to go back to the glorious past and look at the brilliant history and look at the brilliant leadership that basically came out of the colonial era. I think that they have what it takes, and the beauty of Guinea-Conakry is yet to be written.
Indeed, the beauty of the country would be written over time. And of course, I'd like to evoke this. In recent years, or in the past, we saw, the emergence of military leaders to power. We saw that in Rwanda, we saw that in Ghana, in Nigeria, and a host of other countries across the African continent. Even in Egypt, we have countries, we have presidents that still rule to date that are past military leaders. With that said, with this recent decision, Fabrice, LENA, do you believe that this is some sort of breaking the chain away from, what used to be the norms in the past?
Yeah, the question of military rule in Africa had been very, very controversial, because we have seen the faces of good military leaders. We have also seen the faces of worst military leaders. Just in West Africa, it has been the beacon of military leadership. But most of the time, it has not been military leadership, but military dictatorship. Because the very first military leadership or dictatorship that installed itself was just the neighboring country of Ghana and Burkina Faso. And also Guinea, which is Togo. In Togo, we saw the overthrow of the leadership of the first founding president, Sylvanus Olympio, by Gnassingbé Eyandema. And this guy had to tie Togo to the France-Afrique leadership style, and this guy had to plunged its country to the kind of disaster it is today. From 1963, just 3 years after the country got independence, right up to 2005, where he died in power and handed over power to his son. And this disease of military dictatorship was fueled by the France-Afrique doctrine, which was there to protect those who were loyal to France and dislodge those who were not loyal to France at independence. At independence here means any country who got independence with a civilian president that was stubborn and not collaborative to the metropolitan Paris orders was supposed to be removed and replaced with a military dictator. Most often those who participated in the liberation of France in the Second World War. That is the case with Togo. That was the case with Central African Republic. That is the case with Congo Brazzaville. That was the case with so many other African countries. But what they were doing was not only with military leadership, it was also with civilian leadership. Because with civilian leadership at Ivory Coast, Houphouët-Boigny was a very loyal guy to them. Leopold Sédar Senghor was a very loyal guy to them. Just that, as every human being is unique, just like the French philosopher Pascal says, le style c'est l'homme. Every human being has his own unique style of leadership. So in the continent, most of these presidents who were military rulers, even in Benin, we had Mathieu Kirikou. But towards the end, each of them defined different pathways for their countries. Some decided to arrange the country, fix a presidential term limit for a constitutional rule, and then they left power, ushering the countries into constitutional democracy with limited presidential office mandate, while others decided to just continue with the system of unlimited presidency. But when we look at the history of Guinea in particular, we will see that their controversy came with an opposition political leader, Alpha Condé, who fought the military dictatorship of the former president and then was able to be voted to power. And in modern times, that's the 2010, in modern times, and he took power, but unfortunately, he came to be a traitor of his country by not aligning himself with the principle of presidential term limit, which has been the main cause of military intervention into African politics in recent times. The major factor that most of the military leaders, most of the military heads of state across West Africa is advancing for their intervention into government is non-respect of presidential term limit in their countries by civilian presidents. So with this, Alpha Condé made the country to go back into a dark history of uncertainty, because military leadership is full of uncertainty. The uncertainty comes as a result of the nature of those who are taking power. And by this, civilians can only hope for a goodwill man to be in power. And such a goodwill man depends just on the military and the political will that he implores, deplores, and the prism from which he sees things in order to do things rightly for his country to move forward. Just as all of us can do a comparative analysis of how some of the recent guys who are military leaders in the West African Sahel states have been managing their countries, and those of the other same zone are managing their countries. We have Doumbouya, who is in Guinea. We have Traoré in Burkina Faso. And then we have Niger, we have Chad. So there are a lot of military leaders right up to Gabon. But all of them are managing their countries so differently that you will have to bring a couple of a divergent internal and external factors to see if they are moving their countries to stability or to chaos.
Thank you so much, Fabrice LENA, for that very enriching input. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you listened to your co-panelists, which he stated points, but then looking at Guinea, at this point in time, How might this decision by the West African interim leader at this particular point hinder or go a long way in influencing the political behavior of be it political parties or civilian leaders across the West African country?
Well, look, we are actually at a very interesting moment in history, and the reason for that, I think, Mr. Fabrice, my brother, just laid out a series of issues, and I think that one of the reasons why this is quite interesting is because at one point we are celebrating the course, and the reason why we do that is because you are asking yourselves, for how long are we going to keep up with the status quo? And at another point, we're a little bit quite concerned because the ideas for the coup is actually to restore civilian rule. The coup comes because folks just want to stay in power for too long, and we, the military leaders are like, wait a minute, that's not the case. We need to be able to get you out of power so that we can be able to find ways to organize elections. There is no coup d'etat that has taken place on the African continent when that is not the script. The script is always, we're going to return to power in a couple of days, in a couple of months, we'll organize free and fair elections, and then get back to civilian rule. That has been the script, and that's what we see happening on the continent of Africa. It is the transition, from the military to the civilian that's always an issue. What I'm trying to say is this: it's important for us to fully really push so that a country like Guinea-Conakry should be able to succeed. If we are able to have this transition, and I think that is going to send a very strong message across the Sahel region that, what you did was great. If there is somebody who basically has become a military leader that basically wants to stay in power, I think that the person can actually drop the gun and run, as a civilian. That's fine. I don't have any issues with that, especially if we have seen certain progress. For example, if we have seen that you have certain skill sets that is absolutely needed by the country for the common good of the people, there is no need for us to basically bring another person to power who is going to kowtow to the West, or somebody who is going to basically just do whatever he's being told, from outside of the country, and not follow or focus on and not focus primarily on the interest of the nation. So I think that there has to be that conversation that is being, that conversation should hold. And secondly, we also must make sure that that transition actually takes place. If we basically succeed in places like Guinea-Conakry, I think that the Sahel will be in good standing. And then what that also means is that a lot of the other dictators that lead the continent of Africa will have to begin to think a little bit deeper as to, where their stance is, and if they basically have to go for elections or not. And I think that time has come for us to have those conversations and be able to hold people accountable. I absolutely do not believe that we should sit on the sidelines and basically say nothing when you have people, who basically just has become monarchs on the continent of Africa. They're not. It's no longer about anybody becoming, president. We basically have kings ruling most African countries. All right, we don't have presidents anymore. They are monarchs. And so, if you have any kind of this tyrannical, rule on the continent of Africa in itself, all you're inviting, absolutely, with that, basically being a shaman, with the one trying to be able to predict the future, what you're actually inviting is some kind of a coup, because there is just no way in which you can deceive people for just so long, but a time will come when the fear of the people will no longer, hold, and this barrel of a gun will no longer be able, to stop the people from the uprising that will ensue if we continue in the same trajectory in most of our countries. I think that time will come when the people in many African countries will either drop the drugs, the gun, the beer, the alcohol, whatever they're taking to be able to stifle their pain, whatever they're taking to numb themselves from the total chaos that they live in, and basically says, what? Now our eyes are clear. Now our minds are clear. We have a little moment of clarity. We need accountability. We need somebody to be able to answer what the hell has been going on. So I think that we have to be able to push and pray that somehow those boys in the Sahel and in Guinea-Conakry, make good of their statements and basically bring those countries back to civilian rule, and also hope that those in countries where we have free and fair elections that is absolutely never been free, never been fair, should be able to see, the handwritings on the wall and basically do what they need to do to allow, for free and fair elections. And the free and fair elections will not be installations. The free and fair elections cannot be the situations where we get our own political bodies to be in power just because we are trying to prevent any kind of uprising from our own investments and God knows what. No, we are talking about free and fair elections. The interests of the country must come first. And so we need to be able to get somebody in power who is a Pan-African and who understands the interest of the people. If that was going to be the case, I think that whatever happens in Burkina Faso in relationship to basically going forward with the elections will be welcome news across the region and across the continent. And I think that's something that we should absolutely celebrate. That's something we should pray for. That's something we hope for. That's something we desire, because without which, as much as we celebrate, the military takeovers of this dictatorship, is always going to be quite concerning, because we need to go back to the same reason why we were upset about those regimes in the first place, which was about us having those dialogues and to be able to push for democratic rule. Conversations, debates are extremely quite important. And so once we get the military out of the way, then we can be able to get into a place where we begin to build nations. So I think that that's something we should celebrate when it does happen. And I hope that 2025 will be the year.
Now, Fabrice, LENA, like your co-panelist, Dr. FONGOD stated, the problem is always at the level of the transition, transitioning from military rule back to civilian governance and so on and so forth. With this said, if the absence of say, political or better, military participation in the country, do you believe that this is going to go a long way in affecting the overall outcome and credibility of the electoral process?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, please write on. We can hear you.
Yes, I think the electoral process will only be credible if it's inclusive, if every other actor is being involved. All opposition political leaders, even people who are critical of Doumbouya's government.
Yeah, please proceed. Fabrice, LENA, can you hear us? Can you hear me? Okay, we're hoping that Fabrice, LENA will get back to us in a bit to continue today's conversation. I'll be taking this break and I'll be saying, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. We'll be discussing the West African country of Guinea, where the military leader in the West African country stated recently that the country will be void of the 2025 presidential elections, or the overall election, which is termed a critical electoral process, will be void of military participation. Now over to you, Dr. FONGOD. Having listened to where your co-panelists stopped, I was asking, how would the absence of military participation in the upcoming elections go a long way in influencing the overall credibility and, of course, outcome of the electoral process?
Well, in itself, that would be the first time we basically call the elections free and we call the elections fair. And the reasons for that is primarily because once you do not have men who have the gun, people who basically can get upset because they didn't win or, for whatever reason, and then create a second coup, once they stand on the sidelines to maintain order, then that in itself will be quite credible, so that whoever comes into power or whoever wins the election, the transition with that particular individual and party, will absolutely bring about stability, not just for the country, but for the region. there are many people who are looking at what is happening in, in the country, and they are telling themselves, you know what, we are willing to invest. We are willing to, there are a lot of VCs, there are a lot of companies that are trying to be able to fund projects, within the country, but depending on the outcome, whether people move from military rule back to civilian rule, that will determine whether those investments are made in the country. So I think that on the overall perspective, if they be this transition where the military is not part and parcel of the election, where the military actually stands and become a referee, that will help the region, that will help the country, and that will help the country also in economic terms, because then foreign investors will be able to come in. A lot of VCs will show up. There will be a lot of other companies in the region, small to medium-sized enterprises across the region that will want to be able to do business in the country and also invest in the country as well.
Exactly. Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. And now we'll be proceeding to this conversation. We're hoping that your co-panelists will join us subsequently. Now, away from this, we've been discussing Guinea, and of course, it's not the first time we're seeing a military takeover in the West African sub-region, be it in West Africa or in other parts of the African continent. But with these said, could this recent declaration, given we're trying to comprehend the link with it and reality, could this signal a broader cultural shift within Guinea's military, military regime regarding it, as it has played a very key role so far in governance? We recall from, when Doumbouya took over power in 2021, up to date, the country has been able to, even announce the referendum where there will be a new constitution that will come up with term limits for whoever will become president of the West African country, amidst other changes that have been brought to the country. So do you believe that this is somewhat going to bring about some sort of significant change in the nation?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to the fact that there will actually be a constitutional reform, and a new constitution, for that matter, needs to be written with the people and with the consciousness and the culture of the country. What that literally means is that whatever constitution that we have will absolutely reflect the nature of the people and also reflect its culture. In that way, everyone is represented, and a constitution that is not just about term limits, it's about a constitution that is fair, a constitution that is written with the interests of the people at heart, not just something that is copy and paste from some European country, something that is written primarily with an Afrocentric nature, particularly for the country. If that was going to be the case, I think that that will go further in basically giving the population a lot of confidence in the electoral process, giving a lot of confidence with, to those who basically are electing folks to come into power, knowing very well that they always have the opportunity, to undo whatever they have done, because that's basically what democracy is. When you elect anybody into power, and if the person comes into power and the person is not doing what they promised they're going to do, we basically fire them. How do you fire them? You fire them back in relationship to basically taking them to the ballot box and basically telling them that they're fired, by not electing them or electing somebody else who basically shows up with a better idea, a better future, and a better vision. One of the big problems we face on the continent, especially once the constitution is, because one of the problems we face on the continent is that the constitution is always been meddled with. In most countries on the African continent has a lot of issues with this, because folks just want to keep extending how long they can stay in power, and you can only do that by meddling, by basically augmenting and finding ways in which you can be able to corrupt a couple of politicians, and then finding ways to extend term limits constitutionally. And then in that way, the courts have no other choice but to basically agree to whatever it is that the House of Assembly or whatever body you have in your individual countries basically passed. And that in itself is absolutely shameful. There has to be a way in which, especially when it comes to term limit, that it has to be like it has to be extremely so difficult, except in very rare circumstances, should anybody be allowed to run beyond the term limit, maybe during a time of war or something. But apart from that, there is no reason why anyone should not leave power when that time comes. It's when you run a nation, you must be able to give another person the opportunity to come in with fresh ideas, to come in with fresh mindset, and then so that they can basically push the conversation forward. And if that was going to be the case, and also everybody fully understands that the nation is of primary importance to the people, not any political party, then the gains made by any political leader will also be supported by whoever is coming into office after them, so that they can be able to basically promote and push those gains going forward. I think that for the interest of any country, we win. It is not I win, it is we win. So no matter which political party you belong to, it's always going to be the country's winning. So let the country win, and even if our political parties fail, as long as the country is winning, that will be more legitimate. And I think that that's what we should hope for as we look at the coming elections.
Thank you immensely, Dr. FONGOD. Now, I'll be staying with you this time around to ask you, what role does international organizations, because we recall that Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya stated that we're agreeing on a timeline for the upcoming elections with the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. So what role does international organizations, or better still, regional organizations, play in monitoring and supporting the reinforcement of decisions like what we have seen in the West African country?
Well, look, it's we're just not, finding a little bit of what I called trying to find meaning in all of this, especially at the time in which you're living in. Because if you look at a community like ECOWAS, so far as I'm concerned, it's absolutely useless, to the region. The other brother, African unity, the other brother, that's how they call it. That in itself, it's absolutely useless, in a broader perspective to the continent. And the reason for that is because there's really nothing that they're doing, for anybody so far as the continent is concerned. ECOWAS needs to be able to do more. But unfortunately, when ECOWAS aligns more with the West, and whatever ECOWAS is doing is in antithesis to what it is that the people of Guinea-Conakry wants, the people of Niger wants, the people of Mali wants, that in itself basically throws the whole entire bloc into a quandary. We have to be able to find ways in which we have legitimate leadership across the West African bloc. That means we have leaders in ECOWAS that are Afrocentric in nature. The problem with most of our regional blocs is that we have elected leaders from our individual nations on the West African bloc who are Neanderthals so far as, the African progress is concerned. These are folks who basically have nothing to offer so far as the region is concerned. They steal their way into power and they find ways to corrupt the whole entire process. And then by the time they come into power, they don't know what to do. It's one thing for you to win an election. It's one thing to have a vision for the nation. Unfortunately, we have a lot of African leaders who won elections with absolutely no vision for the nation, and they presented no vision. They presented money in their bank accounts. They basically corrupted their way through the entire process, and then they got into power. And now they are in power and they have nothing to show for it. They can't do anything apart from basically make things get worse. What we need is to be able to have a regional bloc that is Pan-African in nature. I don't know how you do that, because obviously the regional bloc will have to be able to be made up of presidents from different African nations. But I think that there has to be some way in which we basically have people elected in the African bloc that will be able to help the region. So in just not just having elected presidents from different countries being elected to lead ECOWAS, maybe we have folks who are not elected officials from any of these countries be elected in ECOWAS by this president, so that they can be able to handle the issues that needs to be handled so far as the region is concerned. If ECOWAS absolutely was that well meaningful, they will be having extensive dialogue with people in Niger, with the juntas in Niger, with the juntas in Mali, Mali, whether he wants us in Burkina Faso, having conversations with these fellows out in Guinea-Conakry. We need to have those dialogues that are meaningful. There is no dialogue that we should be having if the dialogue is laced with ideas from the West, if the dialogue is laced with conversations from the East. We need to be able to have conversations that are laced with ideas of the people to which it is that we are representing, Africans, with African agenda, with African ideas, Africans, people who basically will say, this is exactly how we want our country to be, and this is what we're going to do to push our country forward. I think that's the most credible thing to do if the ECOWAS and the Western Bloc wants to be able to do anything for the continent or for Guinea-Conakry. I think that that's where we start. Let them get into intense dialogue and figure out how they can help. The ideas about sanctions and the threat of sanctions, it's basically laughable. And obviously, if you ask those boys in Niger, whatever sanctions that, or in Niger or in the Sahelan region for that matter, whatever sanctions that ECOWAS has thrown at them has not worked. And frankly speaking, will not work.
These recent announcements which we have seen in the West African country, could this impact, the relations that Guinea has with other countries in the sub-region in terms of governance, in terms of security? Because you note that Guinea is not the only country that has underwent a military coup and is in the process of, experiences a transition back to civilian rule.
Obviously, once they get back into civilian rule, they will be accepted back into the bloc for sure. And they will have basically favorable relationships with countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and the list goes on. What I'm saying is this, that is when things do change in Guinea.
That is true.
But while we are still at it, while we are still trying to be able to get to that level of a civilian role, we cannot alienate Guinea and basically allow those boys to themselves with the idea that, we're going to threaten them with sanctions and say, if you're not going to, comply, this will happen to you. No, we need to be able to have dialogue. There has to be conversations. There has to be those conversations going on, basically aiding, helping, and shaping, whatever process that they need to carry out. If it basically comes to the fact that they have to work on their constitution, then let them do that. Basically, present to the bloc whatever constitutions that they've written and basically say, this is what we're going to adhere to. We're having elections on this particular date, and then they go ahead and have it. But the idea to alienate a particular country because they're going through a political turmoil and they're having to face their destiny in their hands, they're having issues and they're struggling to be able to charter their own course, and then we sit on the sidelines and we're aligning with the West and we're listening to Washington DC tell us exactly how we should and should not be able to treat any country on the African continent is laughable. We're Africans and the salvation of the continent is onshore, not offshore. It is with us as a people, and we have to be able to treat every country on the continent of Africa with a little bit more respect and listen a little bit more than threats.
Yeah, you mentioned what relations, how it's going to impact relations with regional actors, across the sub-region, and notably countries within West Africa. But what about, global powers? Because we're seeing these countries within the West African sub-region, especially those that, underwent military coups, reshaping some sort of partnerships with different partners, as opposed to, the former colonial master, which used to be France, and they're now choosing, new partners in terms of different aspects in the region. So how is this going to impact, the relationship that Guinea has with, other external parties in terms of cooperation?
Two things. Number one, I am not a big fan, absolutely, when it comes to any African country basically aligning with the West or aligning with the East. I think that in itself, it's basically not that productive. We need to be able to align with ourselves. We are Africans, we need to align with ourselves. And the reason for that is because the only kind of alignment that does matters is basically going to be on the area of trade. We will be able to sell to whoever we want to sell to and buy from whoever we want to buy from if it is fair. So for us to be able to basically have any kind of fair pricing, we need to be able to be broad enough so that we can fully be able, to get some kind of competition in the marketplace, for our own goods and services. Once you have only one particular person in the market selling a particular product, you are bound to basically pay more than you're supposed to. But once you have multiple people selling a particular product, the competition is high, then you have the capacity to be able to negotiate on better pricing. That's what Africa needs. We don't need to basically tell the West to go do things to themselves or tell the East we want you. No, we basically say, you know what, we're Africans, we want to take care of things by ourselves. We want to focus on us as a continent, as a country, and then allow for the rest of the world to compete for our own goods and services. In that way, the best price point for us basically wins and the country prospers. Like was the case in Niger, when one particular country called France was basically stifling every single uranium that they had in the country at 70 cents per kilo. Meanwhile, it was being sold in the world market for $300 per kilo. That in itself was something that was absolutely abhorring, and thank God that did change. Now the competition is now open for the rest of the world. That's what we need. If you look at the country like Guinea Conakry, or these are countries that are very heavy. Guinea-Bissau, they are very big on bauxite, which is basically used in making aluminium. And so there has to be a way in which we get into a place where we allow the rest of the world to basically trade. And the only way that will happen is if we move into the civilian rule. Once we move into civilian rule, the markets are open. The rest of the world will begin to trade again with the country. Guinea will be in a very good place because everybody will start trading, and that's what brings about development. Then you have a lot of folks on the outside that will want to be able to come into the country and invest. With that, which it's going to be a little bit difficult, for a lot of countries to deal with the country once it is still in the military rule. And reasons being, within the military rule, anything can happen. So anybody who is bringing any kind of investments in the country wants to make sure that the country is stable. There is always going to be a peaceful transition of power, and that way their money that they've invested in the country is quite secured and they're not at the risk of losing everything.
Exactly. We're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Point. Now, to culminate today's conversation, Dr. FONGOD, what lessons could other nations in the African continent that are under a military regime are facing similar challenges learn from Guinea's recent development? That is, if it actually, come to pass, and it's a commitment to returning the country back to civilian rule and the nation's commitment to separating the military from elections.
Well, that the idea of basically seizing power when whoever is in power would not respect the constitution might be legitimate, especially in certain countries and certain cases. But then the transition back to civilian rule is absolutely the test of whatever coup that was being carried out in the first place. If the transition into civilian rule does not take place, then the coup in itself becomes illegitimate. If the reason to which it is that the coup took place was because we wanted to bring the country back into the hands of the people by basically getting folks elected and respecting term limits and not augmenting the constitution just so that they can stay in power forever, if that was going to be the case, and there's a transition that follows where we give back to the people and allow for fresh elections, that itself is something that I think we should value and we should respect. Once Guinea Conakry goes through this, which I believe absolutely that they will, because obviously the world is watching and everyone is watching, and there's no reason why they should not. I think that the rest of the boys in the Sahel region will have to follow suit. What that means is this: if they think that they want to be able to basically stand for elections, then they need to drop the gun, become civilians, and actually participate like everybody else, and also make sure that if they win, then they are free to take power, and if they lose, then they have to respect the elections and allow for whoever has won the elections to continue. But in the case that you really are in love with the country and want to be able to respect the country and to respect respect the rule of law, then they should basically exclude themselves from any political, party and from the elections in itself, like the boys in Guinea are doing, and allow for civilians to basically run things and allow the country to return back into, democratic rule. I think that that's where we go, and I think that that will set a good precedence for those boys in the Sahel to be able to look forward, and hopefully those who have this military mindset on the continent of Africa will be able to have a different view, knowing mindfully well that civilian rule is the way to go. We need to be able to have free and fair elections. We need to be able to have public discourse and dialogue. We need to be able to have people to talk and share ideas without being afraid that they'll be locked up, because of their ideas. People should be able to express how they feel. They should be able to express their sentiments, and should be able to at least help charter the beautiful cause for the country. It's our country, it's our continent. We have to fight for it.
Thank you immensely, Dr. FONGOD, for your participation in today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me.
Meanwhile, I equally acknowledge the participation and input of FABRICE LENA, a politician who joined us on the course of today's edition of the program. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's edition of Talking Point, where we're discussing Guinea in West Africa, where the nation's transitional leader, Mamadi Doumbouya, stated that the country's elections in 2025 would not include any military partner. Of course, it's on that note that we were discussing, and it's on this note, ladies and gentlemen, that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point, only on your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. Thank you for watching, and stay in company of our numerous programs.